Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It is wonderful to see such a great mix of students, parents, and counselors from all over India, and even some families joining us in Dubai. Welcome. This webinar series is brought to you by Gen Next Education and the International Knowledge Center. The International Knowledge Center, or as we call it, the IKC, is based in Bangalore, India. The IKC is a Gen Next Education initiative, a company based in St. Paul, Minnesota in the US. Why do we exist? It is clear that there's a very strong desire in India to be in the US. But the truth is there's simultaneously a lack of information and too much information out there. We create opportunities like this webinar to bring you clear guidance and manageable steps to going to study in the US. We work with high schools and guidance counselors in India and also now in the Middle East, and we provide advising to students and their families completely free of cost. On the US side, we provide a platform for universities to reach out to students and connect you to university resources. In just a moment, I will introduce you. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with our presenters' contact information and link to the recording, along with a survey. We ask that you complete the survey to help us improve these webinars. If throughout the webinar you have questions come up, you can type them into the chat box and we will review and answer them at the end. Right now, Evelyn is our Director of Partner Engagement, and she has also worked for over 7 years in international recruiting at IUPUI, which is one of our partner universities. So here's Evelyn.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to get on this call with us. And we're going to talk about the admissions process. So I have just recently joined Gen Next and the International Knowledge Center as Director of Partner Engagement. Before that, I spent 7 years in international higher education at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And 4 of those years specifically doing international admissions, working with students from all over the world. But especially one of my favorite places to go twice a year was to India and to meet with high school students and with parents and with guidance counselors about this very topic. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. So what will be covered in today's session? We're going to talk about where to start, kind of the approach that we have found works best for students and families as they're going through this process. We're going to talk a little bit about what are the university standards, what are universities actually looking for, and then we are also going to go into, of course, the application process. What are those pieces that you need? When should you actually be applying? When should you be starting this process? And then what supporting documentation is needed. So, first of all, I was thinking about how to best represent this and the approach that we've seen works best and what I have seen works best in my years in international admissions. And I think that there has kind of been this dichotomy between 2 different approaches. One is that students kind of feel the need to be carried through the process, maybe having other people do the application process for them, and then that versus just doing it all on your own, striking out on your own and trying to get over those hurdles of doing the application process without any guidance whatsoever. So what I would like to propose, what I think is the best solution, is kind of a mix between the 2. And we have this adorable picture of kittens helping each other up. So what we feel works, what we have seen work, is actually guiding students through the process. And there are a few reasons to do this. if you have other people doing the entire process for you, just kind of handing that off, then what can happen is that you get left out of those pieces. You don't get all the paperwork that you need. You miss out on deadlines. You miss out on scholarship opportunities. And then the other part of it is that universities really want to be connected directly to you. So as you're going through the process, whatever you end up doing, whatever approach you end up taking, be sure that you work directly as much as possible with the universities. GenNext and the International Knowledge Center is a consortium of universities, and one of our goals is to connect you directly with university representatives, because at the end of the day, when it comes to questions about the university, about their policies, about their deadlines, there are so many differences and variations that it's really important to get in touch with the university directly, because they're the best source of information about themselves. Okay, so you have made your list of the different universities you want to apply to. And here I'm showing our consortium partners. And then also you might want to apply to a few other universities as well. We will help you apply to any university you want, guide you through that process. But we know a little bit more about the universities, these universities that we work with directly in the center that are consortium partners. But again, if you have on your wish list other universities, we will help with those. And I've kind of put those out in the periphery. So in the center, Gustavus Adolphus, the University of Iowa, the University of New Mexico, Nova Southeastern, Rutgers, University of Delaware, IUPUI, University of St. Thomas, Kansas State, and St. Cloud. Those are our consortium partners that we work with directly. And this brings up that's a nice mix of both small and large institutions that have a variety of different admission standards, even within this grouping. So we'll get into that a little bit more. What are these universities actually looking for? And here again is something where I wish there was an easy answer. I have parents come up to me and say, what is it that is going to get me into X, Y, and Z university? And a lot of times the answer is it depends. But there are some general guidelines. Most large public universities are looking for a B or better average students, and we'll get into what that means a little bit. But really what universities are looking for are students who will be successful and contribute to their campus. So keep that in mind. And you may already kind of be thinking that and understand that, but sometimes we don't see students actually incorporating that into their process. So it's important to keep in mind. What about you is going to help a particular university advance their mission, advance the things they're looking for? They want students. You already are bringing diversity to their campuses by being a student, either who is a U.S. citizen who lives in India or an Indian citizen. Regardless of which country you're coming from, you have something to add to their campus. So what is that? And that's another reason why you need to be part of the process when you're doing the application, because if someone else is doing that application for you, then it ends up being very generic, and you can't stand out. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So before we get into what actually is part of an application, let's talk about deadlines. There are so many deadlines that are discussed and talked about, and I think it can be very confusing for people. There tend to be published deadlines that universities put on their websites, and you need to pay attention to those. So for instance, when I was at IUPUI, our application deadline, we had a couple of different ones. One was November 1, It still is November 1 for students who want to be considered for the Honors College, who are very high ability students, very strong students with high marks in the 90th percentile. And students who want to do a more rigorous coursework when they come to campus. Then our general admission deadline was March 1st. And that was the deadline by which students really needed to have started their application. And then we also had internal deadlines by which we could grant extensions. But you don't want to hope that a university will grant you an extension. You really want to get your application at least started, if not completed, by those deadlines. And that's part of what we can guide you through is, okay, when do you need to have things submitted? When do you need to put everything together? Rolling admissions is a term that gets used a lot. All that means is that a university will consider your application at any time and will consider you for the next available term. So let's say, for instance, the term starts September 1st, then they have an internal idea of how long it will take to get you admitted and processed and give you enough time to do your visa application and actually come to the university. So while there is rolling admissions, it just means that you will be considered for the next available term. There are rarely, if ever, situations where universities will let you start a semester midterm. Most of the time you are going to have to start at the beginning of a semester. If you have missed the deadlines, then usually you will just be deferred for the next available term. So if, for instance, at IUPUI, you apply after March 1st, there is still some time for consideration, but after a certain point, your application would be deferred until for you to enroll for spring, which is January of the following year. So it's definitely something to be mindful of as you start this process. And then early action and early decision, we are actually going to cover on November 5th. Nova Southeastern University is going to also be talking about the admissions process. So you can stay tuned for that and join the webinar then to get a little bit deeper into the deadlines. Generally speaking, the best rule of thumb is that if you're in the 12th grade, now is a good time to be starting your applications. And if you're in 11th grade and listening to this webinar, that's fantastic because it means you can start thinking about what you need to prepare and what's going to make you a good applicant. So, what do universities actually need to see you do? Most of the time, those deadlines are apply by dates. So you need to have started the application by then. I see a lot of students who don't want to start the process until they have all those pieces. They're like, well, I haven't finished. I don't have my 12th grade scores yet. I haven't done my board exams for 12th. In the US, you will apply for universities before your 12th grade is over. It is not like in India where you wait until after you have finished high school or before you start applying. You need to start that process much, much sooner. In the US, that's what US high schools are doing. Universities are making admission decisions based on your 10th, 11th, and predicted scores for the 12th, and maybe sometimes 9th grades. You've probably heard that the US is a holistic approach when it comes to looking at a student and their application, and that's true to some extent. I would say as a general rule of thumb for larger institutions, especially large state institutions, they are really just looking at your grades and your test scores. They might consider letters of recommendations or essays or your extracurriculars if, let's say, you're a borderline student, like maybe you got a bad grade in a math class, but there's some slight, extenuating circumstances, like there was an illness in the family or something like that, and maybe you could refer to that in an essay. But for the most part, again, large public institutions are really just going to look at your academics and your test scores because they see so many applications that they have to kind of automate that process a little bit more. When it comes to smaller institutions and private institutions and maybe universities that don't have as many international students and so they're trying to reach out, they might be able to be a little bit more flexible. And part of guiding through the process when you're working with the International Knowledge Center, for instance, or if you are working just on your own, one of the things that can help is talking a little bit about essays. I forgot to list interviews on this list, and we'll talk about those in a second as well. As far as the academics go, what do universities need to see? If you have been talking to us at all throughout the process, you may already know that when it comes to grade conversion in the Indian school system, you are at a very strong advantage because the CBSC curriculum, for instance, is considered to be a very rigorous process, very strong academically, so it is weighted very heavily in your favor. Generally speaking, the equivalency of an A for a CBSC student is going to be in the 60th to 70th percentile. And for other boards, it's going to be a 70 to an 80. So again, 70% is the equivalent of an A in the US in most cases for a CBSC or local board student, which means that your opportunities for admission and for scholarships are very good. Also, there is at a lot of large public institutions, you're not really competing against other students. If you meet the admission criteria, you're in. You're more competing against yourself almost. When it comes to test scores, universities are looking for SAT and ACT. Again, it depends. Some universities, like Rutgers, for instance, does require that students have an SAT score, even if they're international students. If you're applying to some place like IUPUI, you don't have to have SAT or ACT scores in order to be admitted. However, I would strongly encourage you, if you are applying to the US, to any institution in the US, you really need to take the SAT or ACT. Why? Because so many scholarships are also tied to test scores. So be sure to keep that in mind. Again, I can't give you a magic number for what is the best SAT score to have. We joke sometimes that you should have a 2400. You don't need to have a 2400 in order to get really good scholarships. Again, because my background is from Indiana University and Purdue University, Indianapolis, I will use that as an example. Our requirement for our top merit scholarship was 1250, and we're only looking at the critical reading and math sections. Now, one of the things to take into consideration is that the SAT scoring has changed. So that number is going to vary depending on whether you took the SAT before March 2016 or after March 2016, because the scoring changed slightly. Again, we won't get into that too much more here. We will probably get into it a little bit deeper on November 5th, so stay tuned again for that. Then will you need TOEFL or IELTS to prove English proficiency? You might. You might also be able to use your SAT or ACT scores for English proficiency from the writing or critical reading section. And again, that's going to depend from university to university. Letters of recommendation, those should be from not from another student or from your parents. Those should be from a teacher, or if you have done any sort of internship or extracurricular, it could be from a coach, but it should really be from someone who has worked with you and seen you be exceptional. A general letter from your school might be okay, but if you're going to go to the trouble of getting letters of recommendation, you might as well put your best foot forward and get a strong letter from someone who actually does know you. Then when it comes to essays, essay topics, again, I'm not going to get in too deeply. Those are going to vary. What my suggestion here is that more than anything else, pay attention to the instructions for the essay. If you are being asked for a 2-page essay, do not send a 7-page essay. Be sure that you write to the topic specifically. I have been on scholarship committees where we saw students sending in what was clearly an essay for another scholarship. They didn't address the specific questions that were asked. And it can be a bit exhausting to write a specific one for each university, but that's really what you need to do in order to really stand out. And you have to remember that university admissions officers, when they review files, they're reviewing hundreds, sometimes even 1,000 essays or 1,000 applications. And so they know how to spot something that's generic. They know how to spot something that wasn't written by a student. So be sure to keep that in mind. I will talk about finances, and then I also want to spend a minute talking about interviews. As far as the finances go, part of the visa requirement is that every university comes up with a figure, a cost estimate for what it will cost to study at their university, tuition and fees, and then also an estimate of living expenses and maybe a little bit for health insurance and also books and supplies. That total cost is what a university refers to as their I-20 cost, because the I-20, of course, is what you want to get. That's your ticket to go get a visa interview. So you can ask a university, what is your I-20 cost? And if you want to see how much they know about India, you can ask them how much their I-20 cost is in lakh rupees, and see if they know the answer. All right, the last thing I want to talk about with supporting documents is essays. I'm sorry, we've already talked about essays. Interviews, that's what I wanted to talk about. Interview process. So we actually just had a student in advising that I'm going to use it as an example who was applying to MIT and had an interview coming up, and they wanted to know what to do, how to prepare for that interview. And we were actually able to reach out to an MIT alum that we know and ask them, okay, what did that look like? And again, it requires a little bit of finesse, and it requires a little bit of doing some research, because it happens that MIT uses a network of alumni actually to do their interview process. So you're not actually talking to an admissions officer who might have a more critical eye. You're talking to an alum or alumna of the university in some cases. And not that that's going to drastically change what you say to the person, but it means that you're talking to someone who may not have all the ins and outs of the admission process, but they do know their campus. And what they're looking for is, are you the type of student who is going to fit well on their campus? And in this particular case, when the person did their interview, they were asked nothing about their major. They didn't get asked, what they wanted to study. They got asked more questions about themselves personally. And it didn't matter so much what they said in response, but how they said it. Were they able to articulate their reasons that they answered the question in that particular way? One example that this particular person was able to give was they were asked, if you could bring 3 things with you to MIT, what would they be? And that was something that a student might not expect to be asked, but they kind of are being put on the spot, and it tells you something about a person, how they respond to that question. And again, there's no right answer to those questions. And that's why it's so important to be part of the process of your application and do those yourself. Okay, at this time we have reached the end of my presentation. I know that it's very general to talk about the admissions process, and that's part of what we're here to help you do through that process. And help you connect directly with universities. We will kind of give you some general guidelines like we have today, but since everything is so specific to the universities and policies and practices are constantly changing at a university, not constantly, but often do change and get updated, it is so important for you to work with them directly. And it also helps you stand out if you are working directly with that admissions person. So our contact info is here. And with that, I'm going to exit my presentation mode, and we're going to go to questions and try to answer as many questions as possible. In the time remaining.
Again, a note to our attendees, if you have questions, make sure that you tap them in or type them into our the chat section of your control panel, and we'll be able to address those questions.
Thank you, Yashika. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, one of the things I can also say about deadlines, we're going to talk about scholarships on November 12th. We'll have Kate Dobson from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis speaking to you about scholarships. But I can say here too about deadlines is that there might be different deadlines for scholarships. So those are important to keep in mind as well. And it is so much information that not any one person is going to be able to kind of keep track of all those pieces. I've seen students start spreadsheets to kind of keep track of the universities that they're applying to. If you missed, if you are still in the process of making your list of universities, you can go back to our webinar series and watch the recording for Find Your Fit. Anna Weiss from the University of Delaware talked to us last week about how to find your fit. You know, what should you be looking for in an institution? I can also say from the university perspective, what universities are looking for again are students that are going to come and do well. Every university in the US, the people working there want to see you be successful. And an admission to a university is a seal of approval saying that we think not only will you come to this university and you will complete a degree in 4 years, but also that you will contribute to the campus, that you will do internships and do research, and then go on to graduate programs or go on to do OPT. We do have a question coming in. What should go into essay and recommendation letters? So as far as the essay goes, again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more on November 5th. In my experience at IUPUI, we did not really do essays. The only time we asked for an essay was if a student had been out of school for more than 3 months. Then we asked for an explanation of what they had done since graduation. But otherwise, we did not require an essay. So I do not have personal experience reviewing essays. What I have heard from colleagues at other universities is that they really want to see students talk about themselves, talk about the types of things that they are going to contribute to the university. What do they want to achieve if there's a specific essay question? Let me think. If I'm thinking back to the scholarship essays that I've read, I think a student demonstrating that they've done a little bit of research into the institution is very important. And that doesn't require deep research. That can just be going to their website and seeing what kind of language they're using about themselves. What does that campus value? One of the things we value at IUPUI, for instance, like if you were applying for one of the competitive scholarships, is experiential learning. That means doing things outside of the classroom, not just sitting and listening passively to a professor, but actually going out and, volunteering at a local not-for-profit. Have you done those kinds of things? I can also say that while things like your extracurriculars are not necessarily important for the admissions process at a large research institution, they can be important when you're being considered for competitive scholarships. And things like, we see a lot of students who've done Model UN. That's fantastic. You can go look at volunteering locally. I think if you really want to stand out in your essays, be sure to make it as specific as possible to that university. I hope that answers the question. But again, we will talk about essays a little bit more on November 5th. Let's see, what other questions do we have coming up here? You mentioned some schools do not need SAT or ACT. Does this reflect on their credibility, especially the lesser known colleges? Actually, no, it does not. That's a great question. No, it doesn't. It doesn't even reflect on the quality of the institution or the rigor of getting in. Some universities find SAT or ACT to be a little controversial for international students because it is sometimes considered to be a biased test. Not completely, but it's harder if you haven't grown up in the US context, perhaps, to take those. And I think there's a lot of consideration given to international students. Most universities are going to try and give you the best chance possible. So for instance, you can also ask universities if they have the SAT or ACT as a requirement, do they superscore? What is superscoring? Superscoring is if you have taken the SAT multiple times, they will actually take your best scores from each section and combine those together to make a super score for you. Let's see, another question is the SAT better to take or the ACT? And no, it doesn't matter. SAT or ACT, are kind of weighted or considered to be equivalent tests. We're not going to give preference to a student who's taken the ACT over the SAT. So my advice would be is do a little bit more research on those tests themselves and see which one you are actually going to do better at. Because they're slightly different in their format and also the types of questions that they're asking students. So I hope that answered your question. No, requiring the SAT or ACT is not necessarily an indicator of the strength of the institution. But you really should take it in order to be considered for scholarships, even if it's not a requirement of gaining admission. One other thing okay, here's a question about, I get asked this a lot actually. What about pre-admits? So, as far as pre-admission goes, you might see on admission letters, let's say you're admitted, but they say you're pre-business or pre-engineering. In the case of Indiana University and Purdue, Indianapolis, so at IUPUI, what we required of students was, in most cases, they were going to be pre-engineering or pre-business or pre-French or pre-chemistry. Everyone is pre. And that system is set up at a lot of universities where that first year you are in kind of we called it a university college, where you're taking classes that are going to apply to a lot of different majors. Why? Because the university system in the US is very flexible. And we see a lot of students come in and take a business class or take an engineering class or take a psychology class, and they might actually end up changing their major. One example that I have is a friend that I went to IUPUI with. She's an Indian student. Her name is Indu. She started out as a computer science major, and then she took a couple of computer science classes, and she said, well, I like this, but it's not really what I want to do for the rest of my life. And so what she actually ended up doing is changing her major. Yes, you can do that in the US. And the structure of the system is that you can count classes for different things, but it means that everyone kind of comes into this general studies in their first year, and then they're admitted into their actual program of study. Those classes count major. At some universities, being a pre-business student or a pre-engineering student does not guarantee that you will get into the business school or the engineering school. But at some it does, as long as you maintain your grades, like you maintain a B average, for instance. At other programs, it's a little bit more competitive. At IUPUI, the nursing program, for instance, or the radiology, or let's see, what's another good example? Rehabilitation science, respiratory therapy, some of the medical related programs, you did have to do a second application in your first year, and you were not necessarily guaranteed a seat. But again, on November 5th, we'll get a little bit more into guaranteed spots. Most of the time, when you're pre-admitted, it just means that you have to take those base courses and that you will get into your school, but that you have to take those classes and get a certain grade in order to continue on. Let's see, here's another question. I have received 2 admits from 2 universities already, but the scholarship will only be announced in February, March. Is there anything I can do at this point to ensure I get the best scholarship possible? Well, again, it's going to depend on the university, but likely no. You can't really influence that process. You can continue to email the contact that you have at the university to see what the status is. The there's a saying in the US, and I'm sure there's something similar in India, that says the squeaky wheel gets the grease. But you also have to understand that with the volume that universities are used to getting, you may not hear back right away. If you apply early, which we do encourage you to do, if you apply in October or November to universities, it may be a little while before you hear back, not just about your scholarships, but your admission as well. And some of that is just being patient. But some of it you can continue to email them until you get a response as well. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but because it's not a completely satisfying answer. And I think that's the other thing to consider and keep in mind, is that the process for applying to universities, there's kind of this chicken and egg deal, right? The chicken and egg deal being, which comes first. I think from the university perspective, we don't want to tell you what's going to happen until you apply, because there's so many variables and considerations. Every student profile looks a little bit different. So we won't tell you if you're admissible or that you'll get a scholarship. We will just say, that's a possibility, and you won't know until you apply. And of course, from the student perspective, before you apply to a university, you want to know if you're going to be admitted, because why would you go through the process and the hassle of applying? But some of it, you're just going to have to jump in and just start going through it in order to get those answers to those questions. One thing I forgot to mention is that part of the application process, of course, doing that online application. We're actually going to go through an online application in one of these webinars, but that there will usually always be an application fee that universities charge you. There are a few maybe lesser known institutions or institutions where they're trying to really beef up their international student population and their diversity, where they're going to waive the application fee. But in most cases, they won't. In most cases, you're going to pay anywhere from, I've seen it as low as $20, but as high as $125. And what that's paying for is for them to actually look through your application. They have credential analysts who understand different world systems of education. And it's paying their salaries and their time and the resources for the admissions office. So in most cases, they will not waive those fees. Yes. We have any other questions?
Evelyn, we have one more question. What kinds of things should be included in the school letter of recommendation and the teacher letter of recommendation?
Okay. Thank you, Yashika. So for the letters of recommendation, I would strongly encourage them to talk about the things that you have done in your class, to actually refer to whatever is being asked of from the university. So again, reading, and that sounds a little general, whatever instructions have been given, if there are guidelines for the letters of recommendation, be sure to follow those. In general, as specific as the person can be about the student. I think it's very easy to spot a letter of recommendation that is just a template that a school used to plug in a student's name and send it off. That says, they were a student here, they get great grades, they're very involved. What really needs to be included in letters of recommendation are specific examples of how a student was really involved. You can't just say, oh, they were involved, oh, they were good in class. It really needs to have those specific examples. And Yashika, I'll actually put that question back to you if I can put you on the spot, because I think you've gone through the process a little bit more of helping students with understanding those guidelines for recommendations.
Sure, and I think I'll definitely agree with you. The more details that are given in the letters of recommendation, the better. The admissions representatives really want to get a glimpse of who you are outside of just the papers that you've submitted, right? So they want to see, you know, are you, from the teacher letter of recommendation, they'll want to see what kind of a student would you be when you are on their campus? So are you a student that participates? Are you a student that works well in groups in the classroom? How are you with assignments and things like that? So those indications from a teacher letter of a recommendation will actually help universities sort of visualize or picture what kind of a student you would be in their own classes in the classrooms on their campus. And similarly to that would be the school counselor letter of recommendation. So your school letter of recommendation, as you said, should include, you know, the ways that you've been involved on your school campus. What kind of extracurriculars have you participated in? What kind of leadership roles have you had at the school? And again, those things, those specific details will really sit in the minds of admissions representatives, and they'll be able to again visualize, okay, what kind of a participant are you going to be on their campus? Are you someone who gets involved? Are you someone who takes on leadership roles, and so on? So we cannot downplay, I think, the importance of the letter of recommendation, and I absolutely agree with what you said, that the details matter, and really avoiding the use of templates is key, because then it's not really providing much information. It's just another piece of paper.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Yashika. I think the other thing, just to add to that, would be that while you should not write the letter of recommendation, have them sign off on it, or have them use a generic template, you can give them information to include just to make their lives easier. When I have written letters of recommendation of students at IUPUI for different scholarships or awards and recognition, one of the things that I ask the student to give me is two things. One, enough time. So if you need the letter of recommendation, you know, by a particular date, then you want to give the person writing that letter of recommendation at least a couple weeks to actually write the letter, to put some thought into it. And then the other thing is you can give them your resume. Give them, you know, what is your GPA, so they don't have to look that up. So they don't have to, you know, hunt down those pieces of information that are pretty easy to put in there. You can kind of help them with that to make their life a little bit easier. I hope that helps with that.
We have one more question.
Okay.
How different is the application and selection process for the international students who are U.S. citizens versus non-U.S. citizens?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for asking. And also, it's a point that I wanted to touch on and neglected to do so. So thank you so much for asking. So it can be different. It is going to be a little bit different. So again, this is why you're going to want to you know, either talk to the university directly or work with our counselors, Yashika, Ben, and Becky, to get in touch with the universities about what they specifically want to see from their U.S. citizens abroad versus non-citizens. Again, I'm going to use the example of IUPUI since that's the institution and the partner that I know best, is that with U.S. citizens, even if you had a U.S. passport, you actually didn't even go through our office for processing. When you indicate on the online application that you are an international student, meaning that you're coming on an F1 visa, you would go to the Office of International Admissions. If you are indicating on the application that you're a U.S. citizen, then at IUPUI, you would go to the domestic office. And the requirements looked like this at IUPUI for U.S. citizens. SAT and ACT actually were required, or are required at IUPUI for U.S. citizens abroad. And then the credential evaluation is actually done through a external review. It's done by WES for IUPUI is what they use to review credentials. And so it's actually a little bit of an extra cost because that, I think WES is about $200 for that review for credentials analysis. So it is a little bit different. The good news is that U.S. citizens qualify for federal financial aid. And it will be a topic that we will cover on November 5th as well, is if you are a U.S. citizen, briefly, what does that look like in terms of doing the FAFSA application, which has also just undergone some changes in terms of what they need to see from students and the deadlines. And then we have one more question. My school does not know what a transcript is. Well, what else will universities accept instead of transcripts? And I might turn this back over to Yashika to answer that. My sense of it would be that you can ask for mark sheets, but the universities will need to see something. We do want to see the 10th board exams if you're doing CBSE or local board, and then predicted scores for the 12th and your mark sheets for the 11th. So if you're applying to the U.S., that's another thing that we can help you with, is working with your school to get those mark sheets and send those over. In my experience working in admissions, most schools are willing to work with us to get those. It's also worth saying that universities will sometimes do a admission decision based off of scanned copies of your transcripts, and then some need to have those official documents directly from the school before they will make an admission decision. So that's a good question to ask too, is will you make an admission decision based off scanned copies? And for instance, at IUPUI, they do admission decisions off of scanned copies because that shortens the process, but then students have to bring those official copies or have them sent in before they actually come and enroll at the university. I hope that answers the question. Yashika, would you like to add anything?
I just want to say, I think this goes back to, Evelyn, what you were speaking about earlier, and how varied different universities are in what they will accept and what they won't accept and so on. So I think this question is best directed to the universities that you are speaking to, or applying to, because they will actually know, aside from a transcript, will they accept a signed certified letter from a principal, or what are the alternatives, because I'm sure that you're not the first student that the university itself has dealt with that doesn't have a transcript from their school. So each university is the one that's best equipped to answer this question, I think, and that's something that they'll readily answer for you when you reach out to them.
Absolutely. Okay. I think with that, the last thing that I wanted to mention.
Evelyn, we just have one last question. Do we have time for it, or?
We do. I just wanted to pull up for next week. There will be no webinar because I think Diwali is next week, and so we will not have a webinar. The next one will be on November 5th. And it will be a continuation of the admissions process. Again, Nova Southeastern will be our presenter. They are one of our partner institutions located in Florida. And they will get into a little bit more detail about what to do if in the case of U.S. citizens, also with regards to early decision, early action, of those terminologies, because they do have that at their school. And then Yashika, go ahead.
Oh, so this question is probably one that will be best for November 5th, but I think we can touch on it really quickly. The question is, I'm a U.S. citizen living in India since first grade with my parents. Do I have any advantage when it comes to scholarships and federal aid?
Definitely when it comes to federal aid. So as I was saying earlier, you get to apply for FAFSA. You will also probably there will be some scholarships, maybe specifically within schools or departments that have been earmarked for U.S. citizens. And then you will also be able to qualify for merit scholarships. So again, we'll get into this a little bit more on November 12th when we talk in depth about scholarships, but their universities distinguish between merit scholarships, admission scholarships. Those are the same things. Most of the time you're automatically considered for those. And in that case, the review teams might be different if you're a U.S. citizen versus a student coming on a visa. But in my experience, those are generally the same. There might be a pool of money for scholarships specifically directed at students on visas that you wouldn't be considered for at some institutions. But in my experience, your real advantage is the fact that you can apply for and get federal financial aid. And again, that's referred to as FAFSA. And we will talk a little bit more next time on the 5th about FAFSA.
Evelyn, thank you so much for your presentation and for answering all of these questions. For all of our attendees, if you haven't already, you can learn more about us at www.myikc.com, or you can email us at info@myikc.com. Or if you have any questions for Evelyn, you can reach out to her directly as well. If you would like to sign up for advising, you can register online through the website, register for undergraduate or graduate advising. And again, after this presentation, you will receive a follow-up email with links to resources, including this recording. And we'd like to ask that you please complete the survey. As Evelyn mentioned, next Saturday, we do not have a webinar due to the Diwali holiday. But the following week, on November 5th, we will be having the continuation of the admissions topic. So we look forward to seeing you all for that. Thank you again for spending your Saturday evening with us, and have a great night.